Well, as I said, it's good to have everybody here today. And I'm going to, this morning, continue in our series on Picture This, where we're trying to see what are some of the tough questions that Christians have, disciples of Christ have, and how are Jesus answered these questions? Some of them, it seems just impossible. Jesus took on every single one of them. But he always did what he liked to do, and that is he liked to use stories or parables to help us get an answer that's more satisfying. So this morning, we're taking the second part of the Jesus question. We already answered the God question, what's he really like? And the Jesus question is, how in the world could he be both God and man? Another way of putting it, was Jesus God or just godly? Was he godly like? What we studied last week was that some people just solved this question by saying Jesus was not really God himself. He was just a man who was very godlike. He was had a good character. He was a great teacher. And there are even some denominations who have bought into that idea. On each one of these questions, we're going to be looking at the importance of getting Jesus's answer, not just anybody's opinion. We're going to talk about the circumstances. You know, one of the key things for you to do when you're trying to understand some main belief is to look at the context. You know that. But I think to look at the situation that Jesus was in on each one of these, what was happening before he talked about it, and the way you can sometimes figure out what he's going to say is by how the people were talking before he answered their question, before he gave the parable. Some people act like these parables have just come out of the blue. They never come out of the blue. The parables are always Jesus' response to something. This third thing we do is we always look at the answer that Jesus gave. It always comes in the form of a parable or some story. Sometimes they're true, sometimes they're illustrations by just telling a story about something. And then we look at the meaning of the parable, not the meaning of every little detail in the parable. What we're trying to do is get his main point. So that's what we're doing this morning as we continue in this question, the Jesus question. We've already looked at the importance of the question. We saw that it's critically important because at the core of our faith, the core of our entire life here and when we die is wrapped up in who Jesus is, who he said he was. And also, we found out it's important because in our personal lives, as we're going to talk about today a lot more, in our personal lives, if we don't have a real sense of who Jesus is, more than just being a good man, it's going to make our faith a pretty weak thing. Now, we're going to look at the circumstances more today. We looked at it a little bit last time, but today we're going to look and see just to remind you, what was going on before Jesus gave this parable of the vine and the vineyard. That's his answer to the question of Jesus, God, and man. You know, one of the things that Jesus was doing, if you look in the Bible, it kind of simplifies things. In chapter 14 of John, it's a very famous chapter. I guess I quoted part of that chapter 1,000 times, like Ricky has in funerals. You know, it's where Jesus says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me and my Father's house," and so forth. Jesus tells his disciples, now this is not for all the unbelievers. This parable was telling these disciples. He said to them, look, I'm getting ready to leave you. I'm going to get killed. I'm going to die. And then I'm going to go to heaven to be back with my Father. And I'm going to prepare for you. And then I'm going to prepare some beautiful mansions. It's going to be wonderful as we're together. And then they say, whoa, wait a minute, Father, Jesus, where are you going? They didn't know about heaven and know about having things prepared for them. And Jesus went on to say, well, you know where I'm going. And they said, no, we don't. And they said, we don't even know how to get there. Yes, you do. And Jesus said, he said, if you know me, you know my Father. You know where I'm going. You already know. And they thought, boy, we sure don't get it. And they said, well, just show us the Father. Show us the Father. Give us more insight into what you're talking about. These people were asking some serious questions. But let me tell you one thing. I want us to realize that people ask questions for different reasons. There are three basic kinds of questions that you have to listen to, because there were some people that day that didn't have the same kind of questions that these disciples did. There's the first kind of question that you would ask yourself when you're asking the question, is Jesus God and man? Or is Jesus just a man who's kind of like God? You need to ask yourself, am I asking a question that's simply a defensive question? The three kinds of questions are: some are defensive, some are destructive, and some are discovering. Let me explain. Some people's questions are designed to be defensive. They're trying to defend some bias. They already have an idea. They don't care whether it's right or wrong. They're prejudiced towards their answer. And the reason they're questioning is to defend their answer. They don't want any information. They're just defensive. The second kind of question is some come with a destructive question. When they say, how can Jesus be God and man? They're not trying to get answers. They're basically questioned to destroy, to look down on, to hurt the person or the idea. The third kind of question is what I call discovering question. It's a question where you're really seeking help. Or somebody says, well, how can Jesus be God and man? They're not trying to defend something they already believe. They're not trying to put Jesus down. What they're trying to do, Jesus, help me. Like that fella in one of Jesus' other stories where Jesus said, the man came and said, I don't understand, but help me with my understanding. Here's a question for you. And by the way, it's going to be a very central question in our study about Jesus, is this: are you coming today trying to answer these questions as a seeker, as somebody who really wants to know what he wants you to know, what he wants you to get? Are you coming saying, I got to have things my way. I got to be answered the way I want to be answered? Jesus told us, we're going to learn later, that not everybody who hears me understands. Not everybody who I can give a picture to sees the picture. Only those who want to see it, whose motive is, help me, give me whatever you want, Lord. So these disciples were coming to Jesus and saying, you're leaving, you say you're going to heaven. We know you say you're the Son of God. Tell us, how can we find out what you're wanting us to know? So Jesus gives this answer. Now here's an important thing. Jesus gives an answer whenever they said to him, where are you going? What's it going to be like? How do we get there? Tell us about this whole heaven thing. And tell us how you and the Father can be one. Because he says right in this passage, the Father and I are one. Well, they're asking a sincere question. I don't get it. Explain things to me. So here's what he's supposed Jesus to do. Well, he doesn't do what we expect. Jesus surprises us, doesn't he? He says, all right, I'll tell you. Picture this. Once there was a gardener who planted a grapevine. And this grapevine grew and it made branches and had fruit. He goes on to tell this story about this gardener, this grapevine, this vineyard, and now, if an ordinary person came to him with a sort of argumentative spirit and asked that question, well, now, wait a minute, what does that got to do with anything? They'd never get it. But Jesus says, if you come with the right attitude and you're really hoping that you'll find out what he wants, somehow the Spirit of God himself will help you get what Jesus has for you. So his answer is a very usual for Jesus, but a very mysterious, surprising answer to us. I mean, people who ask a question like, how can Jesus be God and man? They expect an answer to how. When you say, I've got a certain disease, how did I get it? You're expecting the doctor to explain how you got it. When you come to Jesus and you ask, how can you be both God and man? You may be expecting a answer to how, but Jesus surprises you and say, well, let me tell you a story about a gardener and a vineyard. Now, why do you suppose Jesus uses a parable? And on top of that, why does Jesus use such a mysterious parable as this to talk about how he is God and man? Anybody have an idea of why Jesus uses these mysterious parables? Take a guess.
Mhm.
Take a shot at it. We don't any of us know for sure.
Bill, it's Dora.
Good.
One of the things that I've noticed over my life is how the parable changes in different settings in my life, different times in my life. And in this case, this is a very, very common thing you do in a garden, is that you prune. And yet it's hard to do. It's hard to cut and all. And so I think this parable is one of those that you really have to approach where you are today and think, how does this apply today?
All right, good. What's another reason that Jesus used such a mysterious parable to answer the question, how can you be both God and man? Philip?
This is Roger. I think that
Roger, good.
Jesus has a bigger point to make, well beyond what the immediate question is. And when you think about the parable of the vine and the branches, it goes back to Jesus saying, you must depend on me. You have to have a personal relationship with him, with God, in order to satisfy all your questions. You're never going to get an answer to your tough questions unless you are in communion and a personal relationship with God.
Excellent, excellent, Roger. I just really feel that myself, that Jesus wanted them to learn a lot more than just an ABC or a 1, 2, 3. Anybody else? I think I saw Phyllis's hand. You still have something to say, Phyllis?
Well, I was just thinking that maybe this story was not quite so mysterious and unusual to someone in that culture, that agrarian culture, and with the Eastern mindset. Maybe it's just a little bit more confusing to us in this 21st century technological age with a Western way of thinking. But the miraculous part of it is that it still speaks, as Dora said, it speaks to us so poignantly today.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Did I see anybody else's hand that wants to say, why did he give such a mysterious kind of parable to answer a simple question of how can you be a man and be God at the same time? Doesn't make any sense to me. Anybody else got an idea?
Roger, it's Bill, it's Ralph off to the side, and I was glad Phyllis spoke. I didn't want to go after Roger. His great answer. I keep thinking that for me, it's part of it is we're still asking this question. We're still talking about it here 2,000 years later. And I think part of what Jesus's point was in these stories is that it's going to be a continual question for the rest of my life and hopefully my children's and their children. And it is supposed to keep you in the word, keep you coming back. saying, what does he mean? You know, what does he mean? And I tell you, like Dora was talking about, I was out trimming a couple of plants this past week, and the story comes to mind every time I'm outside in the little garden or weeds we have. And this story comes up, and I'm thinking I'm pruning, you know, and it just makes you, it just becomes part of your thought process, and maybe that's the whole point.
Good. Well, yes, Fred, good.
You know, last week you talked about having a body and a soul,
Yes.
and that's given me closer understanding to the question that Jesus can answer by saying, well, I'm man because I'm human. You can see and touch me, but I also have a soul which is divine.
Thank you, Fred. That is a critical way of answering me. And I sure thank you, because I think these people, these fellows, these disciples, 12 of these, or 11 of these disciples, maybe, I think they said to themselves, they were expecting a good biological answer, don't you? I mean, they said, here you are walking around a man and you say you're God, God's spirit. Well, here Jesus is stuck with the question of how can I answer these people when I'm a biological man and I'm also a spiritual God? Well, it's impossible. He said to himself, I'm sure it's impossible. I mean, in physical language, I cannot explain it to him. Of course, I'm just saying that dramatically. We know he didn't think all that. He knew the situation. But the situation for us is, as Fred has mentioned, and all of you are hinting at, is that we're talking about a spiritual concept here, and we're trying to put it in physical words, biological words. Well, the truth of it is, the words meaning, when I said it's a mysterious answer, I mean it's a surprising, it's an impossible answer. So here Jesus has got to deal with talking about a spiritual issue in physical terms. Boy, he has got a job. So what does he do? He goes to this symbolic parable that we need to realize is symbolic, meaning we will never get all the full answers out of it, because it's simply pointing to, it's trying to illustrate, it's trying to give us some idea. Now, the good thing about it is we humans cannot picture a bodiless spiritual thing. I don't know what the trees in heaven will look like. I think I do, because I'll go into that another time. But I think those of us who've been on a near-death experience may have some ideas. But the truth of it is, most of us don't have any idea what spiritual things look like. So how do you describe them? So Jesus is going to talk to us in this parable. And let's be very careful when we look at this parable that we don't say we know. Let's say that this seems like this is a hint at it. And I think it'll help us much better. Let me give you an example. Do you remember the first few words of the Bible? God gave us this Bible, and he said in the very beginning, in the beginning, what?
God created.
Right. Notice that little bitty word, though. That's the big one. In the beginning, God. Now, I've said this before, but I want to remind you as we start this parable. When the Bible said in the beginning God, it didn't say a God. It didn't even say the God. In the Hebrew language, the Bible says in the beginning Elohim. Now, most of you heard me say before that the word God here is really Elohim. Now, Elohim is a plural word. So if I were to translate this literally, I mean exactly what it says. It says, in the beginning, gods, plural. In the beginning, gods. How many gods? What did Moses mean when God let him say gods? Does he mean, what does he mean? Somebody have an idea. Why did he put in the beginning gods?
Bill, I think it's the first reference to the Trinity, because if you look on up around verse, I think it's verse 27 of chapter 1, it says, let us, plural, let us make or create. And so it's the beginning of the teaching of the mystery of the Trinity, that there's only one God, but there's a God that works in three ways at the same time. And that's very hard for our dualistic black and white, left and right, yes or no mind to grasp. And from the first verse, faith enters the picture.
Thank you, Ricky. That's excellent. I appreciate that. Fred?
Apparently, it depends on what translation you're using. Mine says singular.
Well, yours is wrong.
Most of them do say singular.
Because when you read the Hebrew Bible, which is the one that was found written in Hebrew in stone, it's Elohim, and the letters HIM mean plural. I was just joking, Fred. I'm saying that I think the best translation is God's. Now, the reason that all of the translations don't put the plural in their translation, like Ricky was just saying, it's because the translation would not give a clear understanding of what the Hebrew meant. Because the word gods, rather than just God, shows, some people would say that at the broadest sense, it's talking about the magnificence, the grandeur, the greatness of God is that he is all power. He's the most powerful of anything. He is just beyond words. He's so great. Well, the Hebrews did not have a superlative. They couldn't say in the beginning, God ist, or the most God. You know, they didn't have a superlative, so they would say like this, they would say holy, holy, holy. Why didn't they just say the holiest? Because they didn't have a word for ist. So what they did is they either repeated things, or they knew that you could imagine the grandeur of God. And then somebody going to say it wasn't just big in size. He was all powerful. He was all humble. He was always present. In other words, he was as powerful as the Father, he was as humble as the Son, and he was as present as the Spirit. In other words, he was one God who was all these things wrapped up in one. What if you could find the perfect Father on earth? Don't you think he'd be a very powerful, authoritative, good decision maker? And at the same time, he's very humble, loving, kind of like a son. And wouldn't you think he would just be with you when you need him? He'd always comfort you. He'd be like the Holy Spirit. In other words, in the beginning, this great God that we can't even explain, he's unexplainable. This is the God we're talking about. Well, guess what? When these fellows asked Jesus, who is God, when they asked him, how can you be both? What did he say? Well, he says, I'll tell you what, he's like the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit wrapped up in one. And let me give you a picture. So he gives us the vine and the vineyard parable. I've asked Ricky to take a few minutes and to help us see, why did Jesus, I don't know this answer, why, Ricky, but we do have to say that the Jews, and Jesus being a Jew, that they use this vine, they use this clump of grapes they use that symbol a lot of places. And so what was this? Why were these grapes so important? There are a lot of other plants.
Okay, Bill, here's a few thoughts I wrote down. Jesus was the master teacher, and one reason was that he used common everyday examples which everyone was familiar with. Birds of the air, foxes and their dens, a lost sheep, wheat and weeds, fish caught in nets, and grapes and vineyards. When I first began reading the Bible seriously as a high school student, I found it odd that he would mention grapevines. I'd only seen a few on the high plains, and they were very small in acreage, planted in good soil, and watered with ample irrigation. Having read about the soil and climate of Israel, which is very rocky and semi-arid, it didn't make sense. But as I continued to read, I learned that grapes were one of the first fruits discovered by the Israelites when they arrived in the Promised Land. They were one of the 7 staple foods found in Deuteronomy chapter 8. Speaking of the Promised Land, it says, "It is a land of wheat and barley, of grapevines and fig trees and pomegranates, and a land of olive oil and honey." And by the way, grape production is most productive in sandy or rocky soils that have good drainage. And that perfectly describes the soil of Israel and also our hill country. So back to Deuteronomy chapter 8 and the 7 staple foods. Of them, grapes are probably the most famously remembered. Numbers 13 tells us of the story when Moses sent 12 men into the promised land on a reconnaissance mission, and they would return with what the story calls a cluster of grapes so large that it took 2 of them to carry it on a pole between them. Now, not every Israelite had enough land to grow wheat and barley or even plant an olive grove. And honey came from natural sites, which the bees chose. But virtually every family, and remember that the sons and their wives lived with the men's father as part of an extended family, together they had enough land for a vineyard. Vineyards were everywhere in Israel. Both the Babylonians and Romans wrote about their abundance during their years of conquest in Israel. The Jewish historian Josephus mentions them numerous times. So the grape and vineyard became a symbol of Israel. The Old Testament speaks of it. Genesis 9:20 says, Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. The Old Testament prophets spoke often of the vineyard. Hosea 9:10 says, like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. Like the first fruit on the fig tree in its first season, I saw your father's hearts grow. So grapes and vineyards became regarded as a symbol of the children of Abraham. And in being so, the grapes and vineyards, symbolize God's provision, care, and cultivation of them. And they also represented God's people and their spiritual fruitfulness, as well as their responsibility to produce fruit in their lives for God. Bill?
All right. Thank you, Ricky. So we can see that the grapevine and the fruit that came from it were on those people's minds. Did I hear somebody? Okay. I'd like to do with this background Ricky has reminded us of that the grapes and the vineyards were an important part of the culture because it was their life source, one of their life sources. It gave vitality, but knowing how it grew, I mean, we got one of our class some of our class members that have vineyards, and they know that there's a lot of work in it. But when you get into the details of it, you begin to find that these trees, these plants, these vines, they become like something very part of your life, and you just want to be close to them and help them grow and do whatever you can to protect them. Even so, those vines not only represented Israel and represented God's spirit with Israel, it was sort of like they were all wrapped up together. I'm going to quickly explain, I think, the best I can, what I see Jesus trying to do here. First of all, I want you to know, as we look at the meaning of this parable, I'm just going to read the first 5 verses that become where our focus. I am the true grapevine, or I am the true vine, Jesus says, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they will produce even more. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. Remain in me now, and I will remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. Yes, I am the vine. You are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Now do your best, because some of you have studied this passage over the years, like I have. And I want you to do your best to not do one thing and to do another. One, let's not try to examine every part of this parable, because there's some parts of this parable Jesus is teaching about other things. For instance, when he talks about burning up some of the branches, we're not going to get into that today because that's not his main teaching here. What I consider his main teaching is what I want you to focus on, and that is, what does this story, what does this parable tell you about how Jesus can be both God and man? Because that's what he's doing here primarily. Remember this now, the situation, the circumstances. In chapter 14, he tells that he's getting ready to go to heaven to be with the Father, and he's going to prepare a place and bring them back, and they'll all be one. And remember this, he tells them, I and the Father are one. Well, that's the first hint. What do you mean you and the Father are one? That got him into big trouble with the leaders. They said, we got to kill this fellow. He's walking around telling these people he's God. Jesus was telling them he's God. But how can he do that? Well, John turns to the next chapter. We call it chapter 15. And in that chapter, he says, okay, I'm going to tell you how I can be God. And he says, I am the true vine. My Father is the gardener. You are the branches, and you are going to produce fruit. Well, now you can look at that and say to yourself, well, yes, I see the gardener is like God the Father. The vine is like Jesus. He comes off of the Father, and then the branches are us. We're his children. And then, I can see how the fruit are going to be the children of us, more Christians. So that's pretty well cleans it up. But wait a minute. How does that tell you about God and Jesus being one? Remember, he just got through saying, the Father and I are one. They said, how can that be? And he says, let me tell you this story. Now, let's keep it in mind now. What's he talking about here? All right, think of it this way. The gardener is obviously in the parable. He says the gardener, it basically is the Father. All right. How does the Father, if he's spirit, not physical, not a physical plant? Remember, this story is a symbol. It represents something. The Father he says, is the creator. He's the gardener. He's the one that plants the things. He's the one that does what? Give it his energy. Gives us his energy, gives us his life. When you have a dead piece of body there lying in the Garden of Eden, and it says he breathed into them the breath of life. The extension of the Father is the vine, or the extension of the Father is his Son. He says, I am the vine. Picture this now. The Father is God, who is spirit. He doesn't have a body. The Father is the Spirit. The Father then creates out of nothing, he creates a physical body, Jesus. or originally Adam. And then he breathes, which is a symbol, remember. He brings his life-giving energy, the energy of the whole universe, the energy to grow, the energy to come alive. The fact it is life itself comes into this body. Now what do you have? You have God the Father, who is spirit. You have this vine, which Jesus says, I am the vine. You got this son, Jesus. He's got a body, born of a virgin, but he's got this spirit of God in him, this life-giving force of God in him. Guess what? Who is that spirit? That spirit is God. This isn't some separate spirit. This is a part of God. It's becoming one with the Father. So picture this. This Jesus is God in a human form, in flesh. And guess what happens? He then, out of his own life, creates another branch. He creates out of himself a branch. And what keeps that branch alive? The life-giving energy, the life-giving force, the life-giving spirit of the Son, which is of the Father. So we become all one. Now, you say, I can't picture that. That don't make any sense to me. Guess what? It's never going to make any sense to you. It's never going to make any sense to me. So what did Jesus say? He said, when you try and figure out how Jesus can be both God and man, turn off your I'm going to figure it out button and turn on your faith button. Faith is synonymous with the word trust, dependent. When we say I have faith in Jesus, we're saying I trust him, I depend on him beyond my reason, beyond my feelings, beyond anything. I'm just putting my everything on him, depending on him. Another word for it is risk. I'm going to risk everything. Now, if you study Jesus a little bit more, you remember he talked to those people one time, those Jewish leaders, and they said, why are you doing these things? And Jesus said, they said, you say you're the Son of God. You say you're the divine one. You're the Messiah. Jesus said, listen, you remember in the Old Testament, Jesus said, it said, don't believe what I say. Don't trust in words of anybody. You don't know who's telling you the truth. He said, I'll tell you what to do. Look at the evidence. Look at the works that I have done. And if you see what I have done, you see the miracles, you see the lives changed, you've seen families changed, you've seen miracles happen of all kinds. Believe that, trust that, put your dependence on what's really, really happening that's real, not in what people say. Here again, he's saying to you and me, look at this picture. Look at this picture of the gardener who creates out of nothing. He creates a plant we call a vine. It's like a tree trunk. And he said, now picture in your mind. Don't try and figure it out. Just picture it. Out of you, I'm going to produce a branch, and I'm going to produce out that fruit. And think about this for a moment. Have faith that I'm telling you, you're going to go to heaven. You're going to go to heaven. You're going to go to be with the Father. You're going to be one with him somehow. I can't picture it. But I want you all to have faith, he's saying, because not what I'm just saying right now, but look back over my life. Look at the evidence and see what I've done and see if you can believe I'm telling you the truth. That's what the parable is about. Otherwise, why in the world would Jesus tell this parable? Well, some people say, yeah, but he says, I am going to take this one thing. They say, yeah, but you say there's some people are going to be cut off. Well, I want to say quickly, there are four things people have said about that. One are those people we call the eternal security view people. These are people say that once you're saved, you're always saved. Once you have God's Spirit in you, he won't leave you. You may leave him, but he will always be with you. This is a view that says you cannot lose your salvation. And what it says that some of you are going to be cut off. These people would say that means you're going to be cut off with fellowship. That means you won't have a good relationship. You may wander off out here somewhere, but you're still one of his children. You're like the prodigal son. No, you're still a part of the family. You just wandered off, but you're still his. There's a second people that this is about that cut off business as what we call conditional security. That is, you can lose your salvation. In other words, you have the Spirit of God come to live in you, but he's going to come out of you. He's going to leave you. You're going to be lost and you're going to hell. You're not going to make it. That's what cut off means. Not just losing fellowship, cut off from the family, but it means you are no longer a part of the family. Then the third people say, you were never a believer in the first place. This is called the fake followers view. It's the view that those who are cut off are people who, like Jesus said one time, they say, wait a minute, we came to church, we did what you said, we did all these things, and Jesus says, yeah, but I never knew you. So some of the Christians believe this being cut off really means that you didn't really believe him. You didn't really commit your life to him. Oh, you thought it was a good idea. You're like the devil. The Bible says the devil believes, but he's not one of his. Being one of his means you give him your life, you commit to him, you depend on him. So you have these views. You never lose it. You lose it because he gets rid of you because they have not been right. Or third, you lose it because you've never been one in the first place. I'm not going to have us debate that because that's a whole different lesson. What I'm going to simply say is this. The parable's main message is this. Ask Jesus, how can you be God and man? How can you be God with a body? Jesus says, you cannot explain it. You cannot understand it. But what I want to ask you is this. Will you trust me? Will you look back over at what I've done and will you trust me? Let me ask you this. If I told you all in the class, all those on Zoom, all of you, if I told you this morning, I am a very rich man secretly, by the way, that's not true. But if I told you I'm a very rich man and I'm going to give every one of you $1 million this morning, and I'm going to just write you a check for $1 million and it won't bounce. Now, if some of you raised your hand and say, well, wait a minute, are you going to send it in a cashier's check, a person's check, or can I just get the cash? How do you think I'd feel? I think you mean I've just told you I'm going to give you $1 million and you're questioning how it's going to be delivered? What about you saying, well, thank you? What about you saying, I need that money so bad. I'm so joyful. I can't stand it. Think about this again. Jesus is with his disciples. He says, I'm going to die. I'm going to heaven to be with the Father, and I want to build you a mansion, and it's going to be so wonderful. I've got all this for you because I love you. You don't have to do a thing to pay off. It's a free gift. What would you say? What would you expect disciples to say? I would expect them, the first thing they'd say is, praise the Lord. I'm going to go to heaven. I'm so thankful, Jesus. I'm so grateful. And I don't care how you give it to me. I don't care if I have to get a new body. I don't care. I'm just so grateful. You see, Jesus himself, when he told them his purpose was to give them a sense of comfort, that he's going to die, but it's going to be all right. They weren't going to be hurt spiritually. He was hoping that he could tell them so they would have a sense of security, a sense of hope, a sense of comfort, a sense of joy. But they missed it. Why do you think they missed it? I'm going to tell you why I think they missed it. Because they went to default. the default for those disciples was the same one we have. Explain it to me. I don't want to follow you unless I know exactly where we're going, how we're going, how the road's going to be as we go, and how long it's going to take us to get there, and how's the payoff going to be. And Jesus said, wait a minute. If you got to know all the answers to why, all the answers to how it works, you can't follow me. It won't get you where you want to go. The parable of the vine and the branches and the gardener, to me says, at least it says it to me, when the disciples said, we want to know where you're going, Jesus, I'm going to tell you something better than that. I'm going to tell you that I am the way. I am the truth. I'm the life. Look at what I've done, and let me ask you, can you trust me? Folks, I believe we can trust him. And I'm going to try and do something here that that's going to be a miracle if I do. Let's see. I'm going to put a little list up on the board. All right, let's see if we can do a miracle here. Oh boy, oh boy. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
If you do decide to stop asking questions and you decided you're in the other group, you're not in the goat group, you're in the sheep group, and you're saying to Jesus, I do trust you. I do have faith in you. I don't get it, but I see what you're saying. Here's some of the things it'll do for you. First of all, I put up here, I'm talking about from me, Bill Nichols, from my experience, seeing Jesus as God and man will help you have a more personal connection with him. You say, what do you mean? I'm saying when you have faith that he's telling you the truth, you'll be able to have a more personal connection with him because of this. You and I cannot see bodiless spirits. We just want to, but we cannot. We even talk about paint pictures of angels, paint pictures of Jesus, because we just hunger to have a physical picture. But remember this, we don't have a physical picture of spiritual things. We do have pictures in our mind and pictures we can paint of the physical Jesus. So if you see Jesus physically, which he was, and you realize he's both physical and spiritual, he's God, you can picture Jesus. I picture Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I picture Jesus on the cross. And you know, when I try and connect with him, I have a much greater connection, a much closer connection, because he's both spirit and human. And as a heavenly Jesus, I just seem to have a better connection. Secondly, I think you'll have a more intimate prayer life. That is, when you're trying to talk to him in your prayers, you won't be trying to visualize some spiritual God. You will begin to visualize Jesus, this human formed God who came here and took on a flesh so we could picture him, so we could relate to him. We'd be more comfortable talking to him. Jesus as God and man gives us much more intimacy in our prayer life. And also will help us to be more confident in our faith. And by that, I mean, knowing he is both man and God at the same time, while he's in heaven and here. He can be here, he can be in heaven, he can be anywhere. I don't have to understand it. I believe it. I trust it. And it helps me trust him completely. Trust him that he loves me, he guides me, he's with me. And I say, I'm not going to try and understand it. I'm just going to have faith in it because of what I've seen. And fourth, I put down that it's helped comfort me feeling more support. That is to say that I can count on him because when he was here, look what he did. I can count on him. Also, it gives me a more perfect role model. You say, how do you know? Let me ask you this. You and I can know how to live by looking at the scripture and seeing how God was the Father. But you know, it's kind of confusing because Phyllis and I are reading through the Old Testament right now. God, in some places, looks pretty rough, pretty unforgiving, pretty brutal. Of course, sometimes he looks real good, nice, and all that. But when we look at Jesus, and we think the God who is both the Father and is the Son, it gives us a perfect model. In fact, Paul says, and I believe he's right, Paul says, if you want to get the best picture of God, Father, Son, Holy, all wrapped up in one, look at Jesus. That's one of the reasons God let Jesus come here and take on a body, so we'd have a perfect role model to follow. Then also, when you have faith that he is the God man, it gives you a more peaceful dependence on him because you know everything's going to be all right. It gives you a secure sense of his presence because since he's both God and man, that means he can be with us anywhere, anytime. It gives us more eternal. Think about it. If we have this sense that he is in us, just like the vine and the branches, we're just one of the branches off of him. That means that there's something about us, this soul in us, that he's eternal. So we ought to live like we're eternal. We ought to look forward to our eternity and have a broader perspective, as Fred mentioned this morning, a broader perspective than just the here and now. And then last of all, we have a more unshakable hope of our eternal life. You know, just as Jesus, God showed us, just as Jesus died and rose again, because he was God the Father, and therefore he's not going to stay dead. He never was dead. He was physically dead. Spiritually, he was still alive. We are too. It gives me a great sense of hope to have this eternal life. Well, let me see if I can get out of this. This will be a miracle in itself. Oh, brother, let's say stop sharing. Well, that did it. So, how do we wrap all this up? I think it comes down to this. It comes down to what is the point of questioning? Questioning is not bad. Questioning is seeking. Questioning helps us grow. It's a way of saying, I want to know more. More than that, I want to be close to you, Father. I don't want anything to keep me away from you. But does this picture of the gardener, the vine, the branches, the fruit, does this picture help you? Does anyone have a comment or a question on today? Well, it's a lot to take in. Anybody have a question?
I think I appreciate the hymn all the more. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. And that assurance comes from knowing who Jesus is. You know, there's another if then, like we say, if Jesus is not God, then bad things will follow that, right? And then Paul said in Corinthians, I think, if Jesus is not raised from the dead, then our teaching is worthless, as is your faith. So there's a lot of if-thens about this deity of God, and they all come back to the same thing. It's blessed assurance that we have because he is God.
Yes, that's good. When I was a young man just starting out in seminary, and I had never had any teaching except as a little boy in Sunday school. I remember my professor telling me, who was trying to teach me how to be a teacher, teach me how to be a preacher. He said, remember this, you're always going to be sharing the best you can know because you're dealing with spiritual concepts. You're dealing with things beyond your reason and your understanding. So be careful when you imply you know. It's a very difficult thing for me. I don't know about for you all, but when you start trying to explain things, and Jesus did very little explaining. When you start explaining things, because people want to have physical, biological evidence. They want to get into math, and the biology. They don't want to get into morals and get into faith. It's very tempting to feel like you've got to answer things the way people want you to. And it is more difficult when you try and say things that are spiritual, things that are not physical, and you try and explain them. He also told me there's never going to be a perfect illustration. Do you all believe that? You know, there's never going to be a perfect illustration. Like people will say, oh, God's like water. He's solid, he's liquid, and he's air. Well, that sure makes him impersonal. That's kind of a lousy illustration. But then some say, well, he's like a father who's both a son and a teacher. Yeah, but that's still physical. It's hard to tell. So I think the best teaching we can do, Ricky, don't you? The best we can do always falls short.
Oh, sure. We just walk in the knowledge we have and always trying to grow, learn more from the Holy Spirit, asking God to teach us that we can teach others.
Well, does anybody else have anything? Our time's going to be up here in just a little bit.
I was going to say that from what I'm hearing you say, I see in the mirror dimly. I will see in the mirror as is when I get to heaven.
That is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful biblical reminder, Dora. Thank you very much. You know, it keeps us a little more humble when we recognize that, doesn't it?
Yep.
I know I have always had a problem with saying, you know, these things I know. I think we're sometimes like the weatherman. It's going to be raining like storm next week. And I tell Phyllis, don't you believe it?
South Texas.
I like it when Paul Morales gives the weather, because he almost always says, well, I think it's going to be.
I miss Steve Brown.
Yeah, Steve Brown.
And I think that's why, even though we know some people live very wonderful lives on the outside, at least, and look pretty bad on the outside, some people, that being judgmental is a dangerous thing, isn't it? So this is a great lesson. I hope it'll be helpful to you, and we'll start another question after Ricky gets through his series. Ricky starts next week, next Sunday. And Ricky, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I'm excited to get back to it. We'll be in Mark chapter 12,